My name is David Marples. I'm a professor at University of Alberta in Canada, and I'd like to introduce my latest book, which is called Understanding Ukraine and Belarus, and it's written in the form of a memoir. So it covers my entire career from the time when I was a student at University of London, all the way through to my most recent research project in Belarus. And in the interim, it covers things like my time in Radio Liberty in Munich, my move back to Canada, my first job with the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, working with Manoli Lupul and others, and later in the history department. So it covers a lot of things about Ukraine in the early part of the book. For example, visiting Chernobyl, the interviews I had in Chernobyl, and continuing with a discussion of Ukraine in the late Soviet period and early post-Soviet period. So quite a bit on the independence of Ukraine and how that was achieved. And then it goes on to other issues in the more recent past, which I can discuss in turn, I guess. I think it was COVID, I was stuck at home. I was on leave from the university because I finished my term as chair, so I had a year off, administrative leave, and I couldn't go anywhere. And I thought, well, this is an ideal time to sort of remember the past. And I thought, it's been an interesting career, and I think it's interesting enough to provide a description of it, or the highlights on whatever. Some of the more serious things, some of the less serious things are in there too. I have one section, for example, on crossing borders and what that was like in the early 1990s, some real adventures on the border. Well, I traveled to Ukraine several times before I ever went to Belarus. And I first visited Ukraine in the late 80s. 1988. So right at the height, if you like, of the perestroika glasnost period of Gorbachev. And at that time, I simply went with a group of media people mainly from the United States. That group incidentally included Roma Hadzevich, the former editor of the Ukrainian weekly Svoboda newspapers. And so it was quite an interesting group. But in 1989, that was when I first went to Chernobyl, and I had a solo trip at that time. That was my first solo trip. And it was remarkably open. This was a time when everything was changing and people wanted to talk. But you could still pick out, the very Soviet nature of the society in that period. But it began to change quite rapidly. In 1990, 1991, I spent a lot of time at conferences of, say, Green World Group, Zeleny Svit, other conferences in Lviv and Kyiv, talking about different things. But you could see a lot of changes were taking place in Ukraine. There was foreign stores opening up, different companies, new restaurants, by 1991. And I felt at that time there was a lot of anger expressed in Ukraine at different things. I remember the coal miners' strike in 1989 with the coal miners on the streets of Kyiv and places, and a lot of anger about Chernobyl and its impact on Ukraine, which really, I think, inspired the popular movement and other movements. And also a lot of concern about the Stalinist past. People were beginning to question what happened in the past and why Ukrainians had been so slow to make any changes. And ironically, at that time, Moscow was leading the way. So the Ukrainian literary figures who were leading the popular movement were more sympathetic to Gorbachev than they were to the leadership of Ukraine, because they felt that Gorbachev was introducing changes. So when Gorbachev would visit, they would immediately try to get him to condemn Shcherbytsky and the Ukrainian leaders who were not doing anything. I didn't get to Belarus till 1992, but when I first went to Belarus, I couldn't believe how Soviet it was. It was totally Soviet. Even though there was a popular movement, there was a popular front at that time, and they had some deputies, 32 deputies in the parliament at the time, but the communists were in control. The communists occupied 85% of the seats in the parliament. There was no president, of course, at that time in 1992. Ukraine already had a president by 1991. So there was no president there. So it was really who was going to be the most powerful person in the parliament was really the one who was going to be the leader. And I found it also bereft of foreigners. There were hardly any foreigners to be seen in Belarus, whereas in Ukraine, we would spend nights in hotels talking to all kinds of people, from dissidents to political leaders. I remember I had Yuriy Scherbak and Dmytro Pavlyczko. We would meet in a restaurant, we'd have a long discussion. He would talk about Pavlychko would talk about the Shevchenko Ukrainian Language Society, which he was bringing forward at that time. Scherbak would talk about environmental stuff. And you could do that. You couldn't do that in Belarus. You could meet opposition type figures. I went to a conference there, I remember in 1992, on Chernobyl, but it was more or less from a kind of opposition perspective. The opposition were the ones leading the way in trying to uncover Chernobyl, whereas the government regarded it as something alien. They didn't want anything to do with it. And they didn't like foreigners either. Quite simply, they didn't like foreigners. So it took a long time, I think, for things to change in Belarus compared to Ukraine. And as you know, national consciousness in Belarus is a long way behind Ukraine. It was reviving at that time. Belarusian was made the national language in 1990, and it was just beginning to take off by 1992. It only lasted for 5 years, and then Russian was reinstated as a state language as well. I didn't know anybody in the Belarusian diaspora except for by the mid-90s, I knew the editor of the Belarusian Review who used to live in Los Angeles, a guy called Joe Artuch. And he and I would converse quite a lot on the phone. I knew Jan Zaprudnik. He used to work at Radio Liberty, and he was probably the leading figure in the diaspora in the 1990s. I met him on several occasions, but I wouldn't say that there were mass occasions, where you get a big group of people or a big lecture hall or something like that. Whereas I was always meeting Ukrainians in Detroit, Toronto, wherever, Philadelphia. Got to know many people really well in that period after Chernobyl, especially late 80s and 90s. Belarusians now, even now, I know the diaspora now, but the diaspora is fairly divided. Surprise, surprise, the diaspora divided, right? And there aren't many of them. So it really can render them a little bit ineffective. They've come into their own more recently since the protests after the last election. And I've now attended several events hosted by diaspora organizations in Belarus. And I've been to the London headquarters of Belarusians in the United Kingdom. They have a nice library there, they have a church, and they have quite a few functions. It's a fairly active society, I would say. And some of the people in that society have produced the Journal of Belarusian Studies, which is, it's quite a good journal. I think, by any standards, it's quite a good journal. It's not linked to an academic institution, but nevertheless, it has fairly high standards. So it's on a different level. I found it completely liberating, and it was much, much easier to do. And I found that I could write a lot on a daily basis. I could do 15, 20 pages a day with no problem. Whereas, you would never achieve that in an academic article. And the fact that you don't, you're not using footnotes, you're not being forced to back everything up with some kind of corroboration makes it very simple. The difficulty in writing a memoir is memory, right? Do you remember events precisely? What have you forgotten? What are you leaving out? But in the case of the Chernobyl stuff, I used the diaries that I'd kept at the time. So what I was writing in there was actually what I was thinking back in the 1980s. And so I would say that is a very accurate rendition of what I thought and of the interviews that I had. Some of the earliest stuff, like remembering what happened, say, in Radio Liberty in Munich, was much harder to recollect. But I could recollect enough to give a fairly good description, I think, of what life was like there. And the more recent it got, of course, the easier it was to recollect. And yeah, it kind of wrote itself, I think. And I could have done more, but my publisher said, I've got to cut you off at this because we need a certain limit in order to be able to have a popular book. And, you talked about Alex Motyl, his books are about, 190 pages, somewhere around there. This is the same, right? I mean, I could have written 300, but it's probably about right. It probably makes sense to keep it shorter. The first book was written very quickly. I was under pressure from Bogdan Kravchenko, who was, as a director, he was a very enthusiastic guy, and he simply said, just go to your office, sit down and write the thing. And, don't come out till you finished it, basically. And I did that, but I did it based on the materials I'd been gathering at Radio Liberty. I hadn't been to Chernobyl when I wrote that first book on Chernobyl. So I find it today an angry book. It's, I feel like there's a lot of anger there about what the Soviets had done, how they concealed the accident. But having now sort of experienced the one in Japan in 2011, and I was in Japan in 2011, not in the area where it happened, but I was in Japan. And I saw the same kind of chaos in the aftermath to the Fukushima accident as there was after the Chernobyl accident. And I began to reflect a little bit. Yes, there was concealment. It was typically Soviet in that respect. But in other respects, who would have responded differently, and how would they have responded? And I find it a little bit useless today to sort of try to assign blame and, condemn people over and over again for the mistakes that they made. I found that the case with that first book. The second book, though, I was much happier with, The Social Impact of the Chernobyl Disaster, where I was assisted by Lida Hevka, who was a resident of Toronto today, right? She was actually at University of Philadelphia at the time. And I brought her over to Edmonton, and we just translated everything in Russian and Ukrainian we could get on the topic. And it's a more balanced book, and I was very happy with that book. Even today, looking back, I would not change much in that one. So those kind of things, I think, were okay. My thesis was published as my fourth book by the time I got to it, right? It was called Stalinism in Ukraine in the 1940s. And then I started writing stuff on Belarus as well. So I'm not too dissatisfied with those. I think I've got more perfectionist as I've gotten older. And now, I like to back everything up 2 or 3 times before I put it down on paper. So I'm more satisfied with some of the recent stuff. The recent book on Belarus about the Second World War. It's about memory in Belarus, but it's focused on the Second World War. And it's called Our Glorious Past, Lukashenko's Belarus and the Great Patriotic War. And I'm quite happy with Heroes and Villains, about the creating national history in contemporary Ukraine, which was written before it became a political subject, right? It was written in 2007, 2000. I believe 2 editions came out, one in 2007, one in 2008, from Central European University Press. And I was quite happy with that one. And I think even today, looking back, it was simpler to write a book in 2006 or 7, let's say, than it would be after, say, Euromaidan, war in Crimea, war in Donbass, and all these things, where much more is politicized, much more strong sentiment, let's say, toward Russia, against Russia, and toward the Maidan kind of separating Ukraine from its Soviet legacy. And I think that may have created some problems among some scholars for different reasons. And I think also the diaspora has changed too. I think the diaspora is much more involved in political events today than it was 10 years ago, something like that, 12 years ago. I mean, there are some amusing stories and there are some serious stories, right? It's sort of a combination. I've tried to include both in the book, so it's not simply a hard read. Most of the border stories are related to Belarus, because when I was going to Belarus in 92, 94, 95, 96, around that period, I often went by train, and I would catch a train from Poland. But there was one story, for example, where, let me tell you, the first time I went to Belarus by train, I'll use that one. And I got on the train in Warsaw, and the conductor, whatever you call him on the train, ticket collector, whatever, said to me, "There are many bad people on this train. I'll find you a good carriage." Because Warsaw train station at that time was a sort of drug center. It was a terrible place. I mean, it really was an awful place. And so he found me this carriage and just had one lone Pole in the carriage. And the Pole introduced himself to me immediately. 9 o'clock in the morning, this train left. And the Pole, my Polish is terrible. He didn't speak any English, so we had to speak in Russian. And he was telling me that he was going to Kazakhstan to marry a Muslim woman. He'd been denounced by his own family. So this was a sort of journey to find his lost love. And he got out a bottle of scotch. And he poured us 2 large glasses at 9 o'clock in the morning, right? And I don't drink scotch anyway. But he poured this glass, and we started talking. And he zapped his down and poured himself another. I just kept the same one. He was half drunk by the time we crossed the Vistula. And next thing you know, we're at the Polish border, but he's asleep. So the border guards on the Polish side came in, and they started slapping him around, asking him for his documents, and he wouldn't wake up. So in the end, I reached in his bag, I got his passport, gave it to the guards. They were satisfied, and they left. And they looked at my passport. I had no visa, because at that time there was a story that you could get a visa at the border. So I had no visa. So they thought, he was okay for Poland. He might not be okay after that. So, and off they went. And I wasn't even aware, which border this was, because I hadn't thought about a check on the Polish border. So I thought, well, maybe they're not that interested in visa, But when I looked out the window again, we'd crossed the border into Brest on the Belarusian side, and there were like 100 guards waiting to come on the train. I mean, all armed to the teeth as well. And they all burst on the train, and they treated the Pole very well. He was still asleep, but they looked at his documents and they were quite satisfied. And then they said to me, "Well, where's your passport?" I showed them the passport. "No visa." I said, "No, I haven't got a visa yet. You wait here. We will come back." So the train then went from the border to Brest station, and they came back. There were 3 of them, and they marched me off the train. No suitcase, nothing. They marched me off the train, one each side like that, and one behind, marching down the station. And one of them says to me, "Why have you come here?" I said, "Well, I'm studying your history." He said, "We have no history here," which I always remembered that phrase. And then we went into this dingy little station, which was all in darkness. There were no lights on. And the guy who escorted me put me in a seat and told me to stay there. But I looked out the window, and the train was leaving. My train was leaving. It was pulling away. So I was in total panic. All my stuff was on the train. The train's final destination was Moscow. I had everything on it, all my belongings. Anyway, he told me to stay there. And eventually, some woman came down the stairs, and she had one of these 1960 hairstyles, right, with hair up here somewhere like that, covered in makeup. And she went into this little passport booth, put on the light. The curtains were all closed, and finally she opened the curtains like this, demanded my passport. I gave it to her, and she said, "Give me $90. Handed on $90, and she picked up this thing that was like a mallet, right? And boom, like that. I had official visa for Belarus. Then my history denier came back, and he walked me under a tunnel to the other side of the station, and he said, "David, don't worry, your train will come back. Wait half an hour." Which I thought to me this was something out of a fairy tale, right? But I waited half an hour, and then in the distance I could see a train was coming towards us, and sure enough, it was my train. And I got on the train, found my carriage. The Pole was still completely comatose, never woke up till we got to Minsk. And that was the experience I had. And of course, the train was just going to change its wheels. But I hadn't been through that border before, and had not even considered the fact that the former Soviet rail gauge is wider than the European one. So when they get to the border, the train takes 3 hours to change its wheels. And I'd been nearly 3 hours waiting for this visa. So that was just one story I thought worth relating. And the thing about this publisher, E-International Relations, is that most of the copies can be downloaded, right? So I've had more than 3,000 downloads already. And the previous book I published with them, called Ukrainian Conflict, has had nearly 12,000 downloads. I mean, this is, for an academic book like that's almost a bestseller, right? So I'm thinking, I could possibly get it translated, but it's not like it's not being disseminated. I mean, in Ukraine, those very early years when, I was, I think, very naive in some ways, but everything was changing, was probably the best time, because nobody was really under threat of, let's say, arrest for speaking to you or expressing views that were alien, let's say, to the government of the day, because everybody was doing that. And that way you could make a lot of friends, and also a lot of Westerners were coming to Ukraine at that time. I mean, in Kyiv, for example, we had people like Marta Dichok, Chrystia Freeland, Marta Kolomayets. I mean, all the sort of people we know who have excelled in media in the Ukrainian field were around. And we also had business people like Jeffrey Sachs was there trying to sell shock therapy to Ukraine. It was a really interesting period. And in some respects, the same in Moscow at that time as well. And the foreign embassies were also getting involved in various activities as well. Informal groups were developing, political parties were developing. And I found a lot of disillusionment in Ukraine with political processes and what can actually be achieved, say, through parliament or reform programs. I mean, how many legal reform programs have been tried in Ukraine? They've been since the 1980s, and I look at the media today and it says, Zelensky's introducing a legal reform program. And I'm thinking, what, again? There's another one. I think in Belarus, I tend to meet with the opposition. I've never had good relations with the Belarusian government since '94 when Lukashenko came into office. And as I mentioned, I was banned for 7 years. No explanation really as to why I was banned. And I only got back into Belarus because the visa regime was changed to let you in without a visa for 30 days. Well, I was banned because there was a blacklist, and I was on the blacklist. And I found several other scholars, like a friend from Germany, Astrid Sam, she was banned as well. And there were several others, but they started going back, and I was trying to go back, and I still couldn't get one. So I think I would have been the last one had they not changed the regime. And I couldn't even use my Canadian passport because it's full of rejection stamps from Belarus, right? I didn't want to go through the border, so I used my British passport, which I'd renewed specifically to go back to Belarus. Never used it for years and years, and then suddenly I get it out and I'm back in Belarus with a British passport. It was a great relief. But in terms of collaboration, I'm always collaborating with Belarusians. I collaborate now with a Belarusian scholar, Veronika Laputska. We've published 3 articles together. Now we're working on a book together. Before then, I worked with a scholar called Vladimir Podgol in Russian. And he's a political analyst, very astute political analyst who's worked for Belapan and other organizations. But they're very much in the opposition side of the politics in Belarus. And I feel more comfortable with them anyway than with these thugs who are running the country right now. I think you learn far more from grassroots than you do from, say, political leaders, ministers, and things like that. I would advise any 19-year-old today setting out to Ukraine or Russia or Belarus to go stay with a family for a while. Rather than going to, say, a hostel or even a hotel or something like that. This is a chance, go stay with a family. You'll learn a lot. Your language will get better. But you'll pick up far more about daily life and what the problems are for society. Because let's face it, in Ukraine and Belarus and even Russia today, most people are not concerned about democracy or politics or memory laws or something like that. For example, they're concerned about getting a wage regularly, feeding their families, the heating bill that comes in at the end of the month. These are what bother people, right? Or the price of goods, going to a store and finding you can't actually afford anything that's in there. And everybody is concerned about that unless you're in, really the elite of society, or you're a businessman or oligarch or something of that nature. And that, I think, is really where I would have perhaps should have started. I eventually got there. Eventually did start to do that. But when I first got there, I tended to stay in hotels. I stayed in, for example, when I went to Chernobyl, I was staying in the Dmytro hotel. When I went to Siberia, I was staying in the best hotel in Yakutsk, because that was where we were advised to go. But, the second time I went to Yakutsk in Russia, I stayed in the общежитие place. It was where the university authorities put myself and the two people who were working with me. That was an experience, actually. It wasn't with the family, but that was quite an experience because they had to go to the market every day and haggle for goods, buy stuff. And, these Siberian women, they cheat like crazy on the market. They charge you whatever they feel like. And we're not used to haggling for prices, right? So my initial thought was, well, they want that, I'll just buy it. And then you realize that people are buying it for less, just next to you, right? They're buying it for maybe a third less than you just bought it for. So you learn like that. And the restaurants you would go into there, you would have to pay a fee to sit down. The fee would go to the local mafia guy who owned the restaurant. And if you didn't pay that, about 10% or something of a normal meal price, you couldn't come in. So these are the things you pick up on and you learn. And I think that's important, is knowing how societies run, how they develop, and how people are at the local level are thinking, not people in authority all the time. I think in Ukraine, we talk about corruption all the time, right? But it's absolutely the biggest problem in Ukraine today is corruption. Number one problem. If you could resolve that, then I think Ukraine could make tremendous steps forward. It's not the same as in Belarus. There is corruption, but the corruption is really with the president himself. He's the richest man in Belarus. He owns 18 palaces. He's the Putin of Belarus. You could put it like that. And he's kept in power literally by a bunch of gangsters and thugs. It's so crude, it's hard to describe it, but that's what it's become. The vast society in Belarus doesn't like him. One poll suggested that about 25 or 30% wanted to be part of the opposition movement in Belarus. Another 35% can't abide Lukashenko, but they're not interested in national flags or speaking national language and things like that. They would just like a change of leader. So you've got altogether 65, 70% of the population is in opposition to the government today. So that's where the problem is, I think, in Belarus. Whereas in Ukraine, I think there's a kind of middle of the road consensus, that presidents don't last very long in Ukraine, right? They just seem to come and go. Kravchuk, surely one of the cleverest guys around at that time, only lasted, 2.5 years or something? Was it 3.5 years? I came in the summer of 94. He was elected in December 19. It's 3.5 years for Kravchuk. It's not very long. Kuchma then remarkably has 2 terms. Most successful Ukrainian president, is also the one who murdered a leading opposition journalist. And then you get the Yushchenko period where everybody has high hopes, at least in the diaspora, and he doesn't really do very much. And then you get the disaster of Yanukovych, and now you've got another growing disaster with somebody who's inexperienced in politics. I don't think he's an ill-intentioned president, but he doesn't have the experience. But the question then is, how do you change that? How do you remove the corruption from Ukrainian society? And that's the sort of thing you conclude after all these years of study in Ukraine, right? Is that this should be the first priority for Ukraine. Well, there was one part I included. You did mention it briefly, which was the Cambridge part, where I was approached by students from University of Cambridge first of all, to give a lecture in the year 2000. And they were telling me that there had no Ukrainian Studies program in Cambridge. And at that time, there wasn't really one in anywhere else either. And the Ukrainian Student Society and I had several meetings, and we decided to work with the professors in the Slavic department in Cambridge to try and introduce an annual lecture on Ukraine. And this lecture started a couple of years later. We brought in Roman Shcherbytsky as the first speaker. We got about 50, 60 people there. He gave a great lecture. The following year, we decided to get a lecturer from Ukraine, which was Dmytro Firtash. And we kept this program going until, in fact, they received a donation that enabled them to start up a Ukrainian Studies program in Cambridge, which was a really successful venture. And Rory Finnin was the first director of that. The drawback is they took money from Dmytro Firtash to start up this program. And, you know, many Ukrainians, academics and others, have been very critical of that decision to accept money from Firtash. So I feel good and I feel a little concerned at the same time. I'm really happy that it ended up as a permanent program because I feel like I had something to do with the way it began. And it's still called the Stasiuk Lecture. I was running the Stasiuk program at the time at CIUS. Still called the Stasiuk Lecture. But the endowment that started the program, $5 million, I think it was from Firtash. And you could argue that, you know, you don't question too much. Someone gives you $5 million or $10 million, you're happy to accept it. You don't scrutinize their lifestyle, etc. But I think in Firtash's case, he really is a political animal as well, who has done a lot of harm to the Ukrainian political scene as well. So this is something I think that every institution that accepts funding from major donors has to consider. You know, who is the donor? How did he get this much money? And should we accept this donation? So I don't know. But I wanted to mention that because I thought it was an interesting thing in my life anyway, that this happened. I mean, it's very hard to judge. I remember, you know, sitting in Cambridge one night, we had a banquet after the lecture, and one of the professors at Cambridge, I won't say which one, raised a toast to Firtash. And we said, you know, we should toast our donor. And I declined that toast. You know, I thought there's no way I'm going to raise a glass to Firtash. I mean, okay, I mean, I'm here, I'm attending the lecture or the studies program lecture that he sponsored. That is enough for me. The problem is that Ukrainian studies needs money to survive, and therefore it's reliant on donors. And if a donor just gives money, then disappears, and doesn't put any kind of stamp on that money, it's often beneficial for the people running the program. But if a donor says, you know, you've got to go this way, you've got to go that way, you've got to come up with this conclusion, then it's harmful, and it's always harmful. And academia has to be kept free of that kind of pressure, right? Academic freedom is very precious, and it's a rare commodity these days. It's under pressure from all kinds of quarters. And that, I think, is something I also mentioned in the book. And it comes up a lot with Ukraine as well. What can be said, what cannot be said, I mean, you once posted a headline that David Marples writes bad things about Ukraine or some bad history. Do you remember that?
We have some concerns about the selection process of the upcoming head of CIUS with David Marples. And it seems to be a fait accompli. It seems to be a closed process, and my question, therefore, is how can we be assured by CAUS that it's going to be a transparent process, that it's going to be objective, and it's not just a fait accompli by, I hear 4 of the 6 faculty are a part of the arts faculty at U of A, and meanwhile, Mr. Marples, I hesitate to call him a doctor, has a very bad track record of attacking many of our diaspora institutions and Ukrainian institutions and Ukrainian history for that matter.
The fact is that we have to be able to say, narrate what we actually find from research, right? We have to be able to do that, even if it's not always the sort of interpretation that people want to hear. I'm not saying that you can say, that anything has to be anti-Ukrainian, because it doesn't, but it shouldn't be. It should simply be what you have been able to find. And that's, I found really when I was running for CIUS director and Kuzio started a campaign against me, as you probably know. And I thought that this was really a typical example of curtailing someone's freedom to say what they want. And it really, once you get to a certain level in a community, can take off, right? Everybody will join in and say, oh yes, that's true. He's written bad things, etc., etc. But if you look at the career as a whole, I mean, I've been working on Ukraine for over 30 years now. You won't see much anti-Ukrainian in anything I do, if any at all. So that's simply not my goal, right? My goal is to simply study Ukraine and come up with what I say. And that's why sometimes I get irritable when I think back on that. But it's behind me now. It's not something I'm really concerned about anymore. Kuzio is a good scholar. I think he does a lot of important work. But he ought to stay in his own little ballpark and not try to stop other people doing things. I mean, the situation as it was 3 years ago has died down now, and I think people are interested in different things. I have no animosity towards anybody, even Kuzio. I'd buy him a beer if I met him. And I think it would be a friendly conversation. I don't really think that would be an issue. All I'm saying is that you cannot really judge people on that basis. You have to look at everything. And actually, I've served as acting director of CIUS. I did a year when Zen and Kahoot went on sabbatical. It's not like I've never done it before. And I'm familiar with it. I've worked in maybe 3 or 4 different positions at CIUS. I'm actually looking at Stalinist killings in Belarus right now in the 1930s, right? So I've kind of gone backwards in time and I've gone northward again. And it's easier, frankly, it's easier to study Belarus than it is to study Ukraine. You don't get your head blown off. I'm a national hero. I got an award from the Belarusian diaspora that has the national flag and everything. And they're very rarely given. But I also got the Shevchenko medal back in 1999. I'm surprised it didn't get revoked, but I have it. I still have that upstairs, and I'm quite proud of it. I think I was nominated by Peter Savarin for that, but at the time I wasn't controversial at all, and so it's different. I think as to what you study. Himka will never, for example, have the same kind of freedom among the Ukrainian community that he had earlier, I think.